Hello everyone. Since 2 years, a quite number of refugees have made their way to Europe. Based on UNHCR, more than 361,000 refugees made their way through the sea. Right now, many of them living in Greece. We have a distinguished guest here with us. He has been working with the refugees both in Greece and Croatia. Thank you for coming, Justin Roy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start with the questions with the many reports are talking about the how smugglers behaving with the refugees. In your experience, what the refugees actually sharing with you about the way from home until they coming to Greece?
Well, what I've heard from the refugees varies sometimes depending on what country they're coming from, or in some cases how much they may have spent to make their way over. Obviously, if someone has more money and they spend more money, they tend to get better treatment from the smugglers. And unfortunately, if they don't, then bad things can happen. But in general, it's not a favorable experience. In some cases, people have their belongings thrown into the sea once they get to the beach on Turkey, and they're kind of forced into these small rubber boats that are overcrowded. Usually they're meant for 20 or so people, and they try to put 50 in them. So the smugglers will, in some cases at gunpoint, force people to throw their luggage into the ocean. So a lot of times they'll lose things. It's not a very pleasant experience from what I've heard from most people. And I think that, generally speaking, it's definitely not a very positive experience for the people coming over.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background, which organization you have been working both in Croatia as well as the Greece?
When I was in Croatia and Greece, I worked with Samaritan's Purse, which is an American nonprofit. And during that time, I was in Greece for 5 months and in Croatia for 1 month.
So, did you have any partnership with other organization aids like UNHCR or other groups who have come to Greece working with refugees, or does you work just by your organization?
Samaritan's Purse coordinated a lot with not only other organizations like UNHCR, but also the local Greek and Croatian authorities to try to make sure that things ran efficiently. And so we had many partnerships. A lot of NGOs there communicated with each other, and Samaritan's Purse was one of those that tried to work with other people.
How did you help them? Because they have so many needs, they have so many emergency needs.
Absolutely.
So, in what fields did you help them?
Well, Samaritan's Purse in general provided a lot of things like what we call NFIs, non-food items. So hygiene kits for families and for women and for men. Also, a big thing that was provided in some cases was shelter. So helping to efficiently run some of these camps. Personally, I was working with a kind of protection side of things, trying to help individuals who were at risk. And to that end, I coordinated a lot with UNHCR and other organizations.
You have an article in which you are explaining there is a bureaucracy in refugees processing. You mentioning about the deal between EU and also the Turkey. Could you just elaborate some about the agreement and how the deal affected refugees?
Right. Well, to begin with the bureaucratic side of things, the big delay has been in Greece the appeals process. So according to the Turkey deal, what's supposed to happen is when an individual lands on the island, they have the right to apply for asylum. So they can go before a court. The court says yes or no. If they say no, then they have the right to appeal. And unfortunately, the appeals court has been taking a very long time. There have been people that have been on the islands for months because they're not letting people leave the islands unless they are accepted for asylum. So there's people that have been on these islands, and while they're waiting there, there's some frustration, but that is kind of where a lot of the bureaucratic roadblocks have been, is that appeals process is just taking a long time. As far as the EU-Turkey deal, the problem has been, in some cases, implementation. So one of the ideas was that people who arrived and appealed for asylum and had it rejected and then appealed again, when that was rejected, they were going to then be sent back to Turkey or to the countries from where they came, and that really hasn't happened very much, unless mostly volunteers. There's some people who have said, I will go back to Turkey or I will go back to my country of origin, and they have left voluntarily. So they're trying to work out those sorts of issues regarding when and where people are going to go if their asylum applications are rejected. But the deal has limited the amount of people that have come into Greece since its announcement and then implementation. The numbers of people arriving on the islands have gone down drastically since it began in January 2015. You had tens of thousands of people arriving on the islands, in some cases over 1,000 a day. Now it's a couple dozen every day perhaps. So the numbers have definitely gone down since the deal came into effect.
So the deal, as I remember, the deal was March 2015. So those who come before March 2015, they were okay, they accepted. But after that deal, after the March 2015, they didn't accept. So who provide them with interpreter, with the court, with the lawyer, because the refugees don't have anything.
Right. So the ones that are providing this, from what I understand at the moment, there's the Greek government often working in coordination with other NGOs that in some cases do provide legal services. And so they are allowed then to go before the judges and petition the court basically to have their asylum applications be processed.
In your article, you mentioning that some of the Afghans sending by Iranian government to Syria as a volunteer, and over there they made money to pay for the coming to the Greece.
Right. I'm going to say that's a very limited case. Most Afghans did not come to Europe via working with the Iranian government fighting for the Assad regime in Syria. There were cases where that did happen, but that I feel was definitely a very small amount of people as opposed to the vast majority of Afghans who probably came to the funds through some other way.
I think you remember the name of the Alan Kurdi, the 2-3 years Kurdish who trying to come with his family to the Europe, but finally he lost, and his body found on the beach in Turkey. Right. Did you have any other cases like this, and what is impression about this type of situation?
I mean, it's obviously a very tragic situation. Personally, I did encounter a case where there was a child that had passed away. I didn't see it. I didn't see the child myself. I did meet the family later on. But you did get a lot of cases where people drowned or almost were sort of suffocated to death when they were put on this boat that's meant for 20 people, and they squeeze 50 people in there. So these boats are very unseaworthy at this point because there's just so much weight and there's so many people. So that's why a lot of people ended up drowning, is because these boats that are overweight just sink. And unfortunately, some of these people can't swim. So it's just not a very good situation.
Based on UNHCR's statistics, 26% of those who are refugee or who were refugee come to the Europe, 26% of them children, 17% are women, and more than 50% are men. So, what do you think about the percentage of the people who came to the Europe? What is the reason that number of the men is so much higher than, for example, children?
Well, percentages like that are a little tricky because if you're looking at, for example, Syrian refugees, my personal experience with Syrian refugees, the numbers tend to be a little more even, which is what you might expect if you had a major civil war in a country and millions of people get displaced. So when you're dealing with other places like, for example, people that arrive from Algeria, they tend to be men, or people that arrive from Afghanistan, there's generally more of a trend towards men. Also, some of the reasons why you might see a larger number of men as opposed to women is sometimes they would send an adult man from the family to Europe to try to get to Europe and try to get asylum and then maybe try to bring the rest of the family later. So it was in some cases seen as safer to send a young 18-year-old man to try to get the asylum and then bring everyone else over versus maybe the whole family going at once or sending a mother or a sister to try to do it as well.
Those refugees who came to Greece especially, do you think they had or they have any families in Europe to reunite with them?
Some do, and in some cases what happened again is the father would come to Europe first, and if he came in, let's say, October 2014, or October 2015, and he arrived in Germany, the family might try to come in January 2016. And so in some cases there are places where the father is over there, or perhaps even extended family. So in some cases you have maybe an uncle who lives in Germany or a cousin who lives in Germany. So there are quite a few cases where you have extended family members. And so family reunification is happening in Greece to this day. There are still cases where they're trying to get in contact with people who live in Germany, who are their family, and try to arrange for them to be relocated and reunited with their family. So yes, in many cases, that is a thing.
You have been working for many months, especially in Greece. In terms of providing foods, providing shelter, and also regarding the medical assistance, could you tell us about how did you provide those needs to the refugees? What was the condition of the refugees during that time that you were there?
During the time I was there, conditions were challenging. The islands had quite a few number of people, and even on the mainland, the situation was very chaotic. I was there when the borders were open. I was also there when they closed the borders. And during that transition, there was a lot of chaos. And in many cases, people didn't know what was going on. Camps had to be open on the mainland. There wasn't enough room for people. Since then, the situation of camps has been mostly sorted out. On the mainland especially, there's generally enough camps for everyone. The situation on the islands is a little more complicated because there's a lot of overcrowding on the island camps because people can't leave those camps and go to the mainland until their asylum applications have been processed at this point. In general, though, right now, Greece is in a very difficult spot because it's been a very cold winter, so there's actually very bad weather and a lot of snow, and not all of these camps are properly winterized for this type of weather. So there's been quite a few cases of very, very bad conditions in the snow. As far as food goes, food is generally provided by different organizations. It really depends on what camps you're talking about.
Can they go to the inner cities?
Again, that will depend on the camps. In many places, they're not restricted to stay at the camp. It's not a prison. But there's generally free movement, yes.
And how about education?
Education is tricky. They're still trying to figure that one out right now. The Greek government is doing the best it can. However, I don't think they have gotten to the point where they're providing education. A lot of nonprofits and NGOs are stepping into that void to try to help with these education situations. So on some of the islands, groups have come in and tried to open up schools for these refugees where kids can come in and continue their education, maybe even learn a little Greek. So there are schools, but it's not a uniform education program just yet.
Does your organization is working with the UNHCR or just independently?
As far as schools?
As far as providing assistance to the refugees, food, shelter, everything.
All the organizations in Greece coordinate together, and so it's not an individual effort. I'd say it's kind of a coordination effort, quite often through UNHCR, who does a lot of the sort of management of coordination.
For example, if you provide a specific item to the refugees, and how the other organization know that the refugee already have been provided with that item?
Well, that's just a communication thing. Samaritan's Purse did a great job at communicating with all the other organizations about what was going on here and there. So
you brought communication issue. When the refugees are waiting for the transfer to Europe or different places,
right.
How they communicate with their families back at home?
Well, quite often they had cell phones with them, so often they would just kind of call their family on the cell phones that they had brought with them to Europe. So that was probably the primary means of communication for them.
So who did provide for them the internet?
Depending on the camps, some camps had internet, some didn't. So it really just depended. Often what they would do is when they arrived to Greece, they'd get a Greek SIM card and put that in their phone so they could start making calls from Greece. And in that case, they would have to just put credit on their phone, and that they could buy from almost any store.
In your experience, you worked a couple months, especially in Greece, and also as well as in Croatia. What was the most difficult situation? What was the most difficult works that you found with the refugees?
The most difficult situation, I'd say, overall, was that, and this is a bit general, but there were a lot of good people that unfortunately were in sort of a bad situation where they were stuck and didn't really have any options or any resources to help them. And you could do small things. You could provide them with food, you could provide them with items, but you couldn't make their lives magically better. And so you could do small things to try to help them and keep them going, but you couldn't really assist them with asylum, or you couldn't really assist them with family reunification. And I thought that was a little tricky.
So the refugees didn't come specifically from Syria. They were over from countries in the Middle East, or just mostly from Syria?
The refugees that were arriving in Greece, about 40% or so were from Syria, and then 30% from Afghanistan, followed by Iraq and then Iran. For the most part, that was the statistics there.
And did you have any classification, like how many percent were Christian, Kurds, or Arab?
No, not. There wasn't really a number of how many were what religion. From Syria, they tended to be overwhelmingly Sunni, but that makes sense considering that the majority of the population in Syria is Sunni.
So in your experience, did you find that most of the refugees come because of the war in the country or for economic reasons?
Again, that depends on what country. If you're talking about people from Iraq and Syria, then it was most definitely the war. Whether they were individuals who were fleeing from the violence that at that time was taking place outside of Aleppo and the rural area surrounding it, or whether they were Yazidis from kind of the northern part of Iraq. People were generally fleeing this violence if they came from those countries. In Afghanistan, there were also cases of violence, people fleeing the Taliban or other sort of militant groups as well. You did see some economic cases of people who would mostly come for economic reasons. But absolutely, in terms of Syria and Iraq, there was generally people fleeing violence. And you could see that often in the sort of professions that people had. You would talk to Syrians and they came from all walks of life. They could be college professors, they could be lawyers, farmers, and just the entire range of society you could see in these refugee camps. And that's not really something you would see if it was just people coming for economic reasons. So I think there was definitely a lot of evidence to say that people were coming because of the violence they were experiencing in their own countries.
Was there any cases that any refugee, any family decided to go back to the country?
Mm-hmm. There were a few cases where people did voluntarily return. They may have come to Europe thinking they would have one sort of experience, and then they didn't have that experience, and for whatever reason they wanted to return. So there were a few cases. But generally speaking, most people would rather have been in Europe. I had one gentleman tell me that he was from Syria and he had come with his family, and he told me his story, which was he had been in one city when the war had started and Assad had bombed that. So he fled to another city, Assad bombed that, and then he fled to a third city and ISIS occupied it. And I remember him looking at me and he asked me, where else was I supposed to go? And I think that's a very powerful statement right there. Where else was he supposed to go?
So when those refugees are in Greece, they stay until they're recognized as a refugee, or they go to different country?
Well, that depends on the situation. Again, if someone were to arrive on the islands right now, what would happen is they would be held on the islands until their asylum application could be processed. So let's say if they got accepted, they would then be sent to the mainland, where they might either stay in Greece, or in certain cases they might be relocated, depending on if they have family or if they're eligible for the relocation program that is being run by the European Union right now. So it really depends, but many will probably be staying in Greece, although a couple thousand have been relocated from Greece to elsewhere in Europe at this point.
During that time that you were especially in Greece, does any country take the refugees to the Europe, to any other countries, Canada?
Oh, well, as far as the relocation program goes and the family reunification program goes, many countries in Europe are participating. Germany is participating, Austria, France, Portugal, some of the Baltic countries like Estonia. There are a lot of countries that are participating. Some of the Eastern European countries are not, but this is being done through this European Union relocation program.
Did you by chance ask them why they don't go to the other countries, like in the Middle East, Arab countries, rather than go to Europe? Because the Arab countries so close to for example, Syria, right, Afghanistan, or Iran.
Well, I mean, in some cases, it is a element of kind of proximity. So people on the border with Turkey, it'd be easy for them to go to Turkey, but the situation is not necessarily great in Turkey. So sometimes they would think, well, maybe if we can get to Europe, it's a better situation there. Lebanon is another case where Lebanon has 2 million Syrian refugees, but there's not much in the way of assistance there. So once the Syrian refugees get there, they're in a very difficult spot. As far as why don't they go to other places, like, for example, the Gulf countries, there's a lot of cases where people who maybe had hopes and dreams during the beginnings of the Syrian revolution of more freedom and democracy don't necessarily want to end up in places that aren't necessarily free or democratic.
Obama administration has approved to bring around 10,000 Syrian refugees to the country, and I believe so far more than 2,000 have come to the U.S. So, during that time that you were in the Greece, any refugees you know or aware of that they came to United States?
As far as I know, none have been brought from Greece to the United States. I have met people that have been brought to the United States from places like Jordan. But as far as people, refugees being brought from Greece to the United States, I have not seen nor heard of that.
In your experience working with refugees in Croatia, how they are different in terms of needs, in terms of the situation they live in? What was the similarity? What is the difference?
Well, Croatia was a transit camp. So when the borders were open, people were just going through the borders at the rate of thousands a day. And so the camp in Croatia was mostly for the people to get off, because what would happen is they'd get on trains in Serbia and then they'd be sent to Croatia. Once they arrived, they were unloaded at this camp and they were registered, provided with food. They were given medical attention if they needed it, and sometimes they were given clothes if they didn't have proper winter clothing. And then they would be put back on a train, and then they'd be sent onward to Slovenia. So that was a transit camp. In Greece, originally they were transit camps, but I arrived about a month before they closed the borders, and then they closed the borders, and then the situation changed entirely. So it went from being a transit camp with people basically landing on the islands and then leaving 3 days later to now you have a static population of people in the camps, whereas opposed to a mobile one.
President-elected Donald Trump is disagree with bringing the refugees, especially Syrian refugees, to the country. As I mentioned, more than 2,000 so far has been brought by United States to the country. He's arguing that in many cases they have allied with the ISIS or they have sympathy with ISIS. So what do you think? What is your impression about since you have experience with the refugees, do you think the new administration needs to accept more refugees?
Well, I don't think any Syrian I met has any love for ISIS. They don't have a love for Assad either, but they definitely don't love ISIS. And the tricky thing is that, yes, we need to have better mechanisms to screen people, but I think that's something that the U.S. government can do, and it has a pretty good track record of doing that. And if we have proper screenings, I don't see why we couldn't assist many of these people who are quite often fleeing political or religious oppression. When we say Syrian refugees, we're not talking, you don't think about often the Christian or Yazidi or other religious minorities in Syria, but also in Iraq. And also something I would like to mention is we talk about wanting to limit refugees from places like Iraq and from Syria, but quite often in places like Iraq and Syria, some of these people that I met personally in Greece were people that had worked with coalition forces. They had worked as translators for the US military or the British military. And so when we're talking about not bringing these people over, we're also talking about people who had worked for America in some cases and now had to flee because they just couldn't wait any longer to get a visa to come to the United States. And I think if we are just saying no people from this region, then what about these people who had worked with us, these people who had supported our efforts to eliminate terrorism? And I think that would be dishonorable and send a very bad message about what we believe.
You already have some articles about your experience working with refugees. Are you going to write more about refugees?
I would love
Your
to.
experience?
I would love to. I'd love to continue working with refugees if the opportunity arose. So I would love to continue because they're going through a very difficult time, and I think if more people had the the um, the ability to see what they've gone through and to hear their stories, that would be an eye opener for many people. To hear stories about a man who's fled to 3 different cities, but they keep getting blown up or occupied by terrible people. To hear stories about, for example, a gentleman who fled from the Syrian military because they wanted him to bomb civilians and he refused to do that. So I think that there are a lot of amazing stories, and if people knew them and people met these individuals, they would realize that they're not scheming people trying to commit some violent acts or something like that. In many cases, they're good people who have unfortunately ended up in bad situations.
So, as a last statement, what do you think about your working with refugees? What is your impression working with refugees and also being far from the country for many months?
I think it was an incredibly powerful experience. It was very difficult at times because you were working with many people, in some cases, people who had no hope left. In many cases, people who had suffered tremendously. And so when you hear their stories and you walk beside them, it's tremendously tough at times. But it was a great experience, and I would do it again.
Do you have anything to add to tell people who are helping the refugees to your organization? Or
I would say keep up the good work. Situation over there is very challenging, but there's good people who need to be helped, and if we can continue to do that, I think then we should.
thank you very much, Justin, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.